So, what is going on with the US and Cuba right now? Because reports coming out of Cuba are saying that the US is deliberately causing a humanitarian crisis there. And there's a lot of validity to that. So, let's dig into it. So, for more than 60 years, the US policy towards Cuba has followed a similar script: squeeze the island economically, declare the pressure a moral necessity, and insist that the resulting hardship is the fault of Havana, not Washington. But the Trump administration's latest actions mark a new and more dangerous chapter in this long history of coercion. What began as an embargo in the early 1960s has now evolved into a fuel focused chokehold, enforced not only on Cuba but on any country that dares to help it survive. The result is a manufactured humanitarian crisis whose logic is painfully clear. When you cut off a nation's access to fuel, oil, gasoline, the things Trump is obsessed with, you don't just inconvenience the government, you destabilize the entire architecture of civilian life and punish civilians. This administration's January 2026 declaration of a national emergency targeting Cuba was not a response to any new threat. It was a legal maneuver designed to unlock extraordinary powers under the National Emergencies Act and IEEPA. These powers were then used to create a tariff mechanism aimed at countries that supply oil to Cuba. In practice, this means that Mexico, Venezuela, and any other nation that sends fuel to the island now risks punitive tariffs on their exports to the United States. Now, yes, I'm aware that the Supreme Court just ruled against tariffs, but Trump is already trying to do more tariffs again, so we'll see how that works out. Now, it is a strategy that the Trump has been using that weaponizes economic interdependence, turning Cuba's lifelines into leverage points and its civilian population into collateral. The consequences of this were immediate. Cuba warned airlines that jet fuel would no longer be available at major airports, including Havana's Jose Marti International Airport. I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, but I apologize. Public transportation faltered. Power outages intensified. Food distribution slowed. Hospitals, already strained by chronic shortages, faced new limits on electricity and refrigeration. And do you know what happens when hospitals don't have electricity and refrigeration? People die. Babies in the NICU. Sick and elderly people in ICU. They die. But this administration's actions are the daily realities for people who struggle now to get to work, keep food cold, or ensure that their medical equipment stays running. The administration's actions may be framed as national security measures, but the lived experience is one of engineered scarcity. In order to understand the significance of this moment, it helps to place it in the broader arc of US-Cuba policy. The embargo of the 1960s sought to isolate Cuba economically. The Helms-Burton Act of the 1990s extended that isolation outward, threatening foreign companies that invested in Cuban property. Even Obama's brief opening in 2014 to 2016 softened the edges of this approach, but didn't eliminate it, and restored some diplomatic relations and eased travel restrictions and remittance restrictions, which was a step in the right direction, even if it wasn't sufficient. But the Trump administration, of course, has not only reversed that opening, it has escalated beyond the traditional tools of sanctions and embargoes. By targeting fuels and punishing third-party suppliers, it has shifted from broad economic pressure to precision strikes on the systems that keep Cuban society functioning and the Cuban people alive. In fact, this strategy is one that has been used a lot around the world, and it is part of a troubling pattern. When powerful states restrict another population's access to essential goods like fuel, food, medicine, water, the humanitarian consequences are both predictable and devastating. Yemen's blockade, enforced by Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, created catastrophic shortages of food, medicine, and fuel, contributing to famine and cholera outbreaks. Gaza's long-standing blockade by Israel has produced chronic shortages of electricity, clean water, and medical supplies, with aid ships being deliberately intercepted and diverted. The Nigerian blockade of Biafra, pretty sure I said that one wrong too, sorry, but it was in the late 1960s and led to one of the worst starvation crises of the 20th century. These cases differ in scale and context, but they share a structural logic. When you cut off fuel and essential imports, civilian infrastructure collapses long before the political systems do, and the ones who pay the heaviest price are not only civilians, but the most vulnerable among them. Now, I'm not claiming that the situation in Cuba has reached that of Yemen or Gaza yet. But the mechanism at work is unmistakably similar. A country that imports most of its fuel cannot withstand sudden, externally imposed collapse of its energy supply. Power grids fail, transportation systems break down, hospitals ration care, food distribution slows. The Trump administration's pressure campaign is not a full blockade, but it is a targeted deprivation strategy that exploits Cuba's vulnerabilities with surgical precision. And like other blockades, it is civilians, not governments, who bear the brunt. Now, why this fixation on Cuba? So analysts point to several overlapping motives. Domestic politics, especially in Florida, reward hardline postures. Ideologically, the administration has framed Cuba as part of a broader struggle against leftist governments in the hemisphere. Geopolitically, the tariff mechanism sends a message to other countries: align with U.S. preferences or face economic consequences. Or at least that's the intended message. I do feel like that's been backfiring quite a bit. But strategically, the administration has embraced economic coercion as its primary foreign policy tool, using tariffs and sanctions as blunt instruments to force political outcomes. In this context, Cuba becomes both symbol and target, a way to signal strength, punish adversaries, and reverse the diplomatic legacy of the Obama years. But the deeper truth is that these policies are not designed to change the Cuban government. 6 decades of embargo have shown that the economic pressure does not produce political liberalization. What it does produce, reliably, repeatedly, and with devastating clarity, is human suffering. The Trump administration's fuel-focused strategy intensifies that suffering by going after the very arteries of daily life. It is a policy that treats human vulnerability as leverage, using scarcity as a tool of statecraft. The human consequences are not incidental. They are the mechanism through which pressure is applied. The cruelty is the point. And history shows where this path leads. Blockade-induced crises do not stay contained. They ripple outward, destabilizing regions, straining alliances, and deepening the very geopolitical divides they claim to address. In Cuba's case, the pressure may push the island closer to alternative partners like Russia or China, further entrenching the dynamics the administration claims to oppose. In fact, you saw it do this during the 70s. The U.S. embargoes against Cuba pushed them much further towards Russia as a partner. But what is happening in Cuba today is not an accident of policy. It is the predictable outcome of a strategy that prioritizes coercion over diplomacy and treats civilian hardship as an acceptable cost or even just a useful tool. The United States has spent 60 years trying to force political change in Cuba through economic deprivation. The Trump administration has refined the method, shifting from broad embargo to targeted deprivation of fuel, the lifeblood of modern society. The result is a humanitarian crisis in the making, one that echoes the darkest chapters of blockades and politics around the world. And as always, it is ordinary people who end up paying the price.